Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they began to cross the sea to Capernaum. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. And the sea was stirred up because a strong wind was blowing. Then when they had rowed about 25 or 30 stadia, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened. And he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." So they were willing to receive him into the boat. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. May God add his blessing to the reading and the preaching of his word. You can be seated. At the beginning of chapter 6, John tells us how Jesus went up on the mountain and he miraculously spread this abundant feast for all the guests at his table. And there's a message, of course, on that text too, but the picture is of a feast that the king spreads for the guests at his table. Just 5 barley cakes and 2 fish. Jesus feeds 5,000 men, plus women, plus children. And after it says they had as much as they wanted and ate their fill, the leftovers were gathered up, 12 baskets full. The question then is, how do we respond? So this has happened. We read about it. We weren't there, but we read about it. How do we respond to this account of Jesus' miraculous provision of food? How do we respond to this sign once we've understood it, truly understood it? The question is, what do we see? Do we see only a miracle that leads us to come to Jesus? Of course, when you see this, in a sense, it compels me to come to Jesus, but for what reason? Because I come presumptuously, expecting he's there to meet my needs as a miracle worker and the one who fills my stomach. Or do I see more than a miracle? Do I see a sign that leads me to come not presumptuously expecting, not seeing Jesus as simply the miracle worker who meets my needs and fills my stomach, but to come to Jesus humbly and confidently surrendering? What a different approach. I mean, it's so easy to see the miracle and to say, let me come and have my needs met. And instead of, I see this, and so I come in humble surrender because he's the one who knows what my true needs are. We already know from verse 2 why the crowd was following Jesus. It says because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. But they didn't understand. They saw the signs only as miracles. Or we could say they didn't see signs, they only saw miracles. And so we're not surprised when we read now in verses 14 to 15, when the people saw the sign that he had done, but only perceived a miracle, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain, he alone. Now, what we need to understand is that the last time Jesus went up on the mountain, it says his disciples were with him. So he's setting up a contrast here for us. In verse 3, it says Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now look at the contrast. Jesus withdrew, and then he emphasizes again to the mountain. So he wants us to compare. He wants us to see this. He withdrew again to the mountain. He alone this time. He's emphasizing that. Given this contrast, and given the Greek expression, which is very explicit, and its placement at the very end of the sentence, that's why I put it there, he alone, the point is emphatically that he withdrew again to the mountain without his disciples, this time by himself, he alone. I keep wanting to say in your handout, because I say that at our church. You don't have a handout. Jesus is withdrawing. He's withdrawing. Not just from the crowd, he's withdrawing from his own disciples. It's not time for them to be with him. They don't need to be with him. He doesn't need to be with them. That's not what's needful right now. We know there were times when Jesus wanted to be alone with his Father. That's certainly the case here. He goes up to pray. But the reason John gives us for Jesus withdrawing from his disciples is that he perceived, well, from the crowd, first of all, he perceived they were to come and take him by force to make him king. The implication then is that even his disciples were caught up in this excitement. I mean, can you imagine 5,000 men? 5,000 men ready to make Jesus king? And the disciples, they're the inner circle. They're closest to Jesus. They're the ones who just served as the administrators of this amazing miracle when he set the feast. Had the people sit down, distributed the food, collected what was left over. How easy it would have been, put yourself in their shoes, how easy it is for them to see in this moment, at this moment, the makings of Messiah's kingdom and their own privileged places of honor within that kingdom. Now, we shouldn't imagine that the disciples are exceptionally arrogant people. No more arrogant, of course, than we tend to be. It's just that they had not yet understood what true greatness is in the kingdom of the Messiah. They hadn't yet seen it. And connected with that, they had not yet understood, and this is what we're going to focus on this afternoon, they had not yet understood the true absoluteness, and if you had a handout, that would be the word, the true absoluteness of Jesus' lordship. That's why they were caught up in the misguided excitement of the crowd. And it's why Jesus withdrew to the mountain, he alone, this time without his disciples. No, it's time for separation here. But more than that, we're going to see. It's why Mark says immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. I'm not going with you to the other side. I'm sending you to go by yourself, and I have plans for you on the way. The Greek word for made means to force. It means to compel. The disciples didn't want to go, but he forced them. We could say the disciples needed time to cool off, but they needed more than that. They needed to be confronted with the true nature, with the absoluteness of Jesus' lordship. The absoluteness of his lordship was there in the feeding of the 5,000, but they misinterpreted. They didn't see it. And so, having told us that Jesus has withdrawn to the mountain alone, now we leave Jesus on the mountain alone, and we go join the disciples, who are also very much alone. When evening came, in verses 16 to 19, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark. Again, John is setting us up. Jesus is setting the disciples up. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. So we'll cut it off there. Now I just want you to compare. It's very dramatic, but not for the sake of drama. It just is. Compare the euphoria the disciples have been feeling after their participation with Jesus in this feeding of the 5,000 with the helpless isolation they're experiencing now on the Sea of Galilee. It seems to be the point John is emphasizing because, in fact, it's the point Jesus was making sure that we got. After saying they went down to the sea when evening came, John adds this detail that while they were on the sea, it had grown dark. There's a bit of a threat to that. And also that Jesus had not yet come to them. At least some of the disciples, of course, were fishermen, we know. They would have been very accustomed to being out on the sea in the dark as fishermen. But the point here is that they've been cut off and separated from Jesus, who just a few hours before was on the verge of being proclaimed king. Again, I can hardly imagine a greater contrast, a greater letdown from where we were a moment ago to where we are here, and Jesus has just set it all up. John emphasizes not only their isolation, but their helplessness. So both isolation makes them now aware of helplessness. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. What should probably have been a trip of about 2 miles along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee becomes now at least 3 to 4 miles of hard rowing, and the wind is threatening to keep them really from ever getting where they needed to go. Just a few hours before, conquer the world, now isolated from Jesus in the dark on the sea, they're reminded of how totally frail and how totally helpless they are. We know that the sea in the Bible, and that's the point. There was the historical event of what happened, and yet as John the Apostle, who was there in the boat, we know, as he looks back on this, he sees it in its theological, biblical context and perspective. And this is what he wants us to see. This is what Jesus wants us to see. The sea in the Bible symbolizes the ultimate threat to you, the ultimate threat to me. So it was out of the primeval waters of the deep that God raised up the dry land for man to dwell on. Before, in the beginning, there was no dry land. There was just the primeval waters of chaos, as it were. And God says, I'm going to raise up out of all that something for man to live on. It's then, therefore, the sea in Exodus that stands in the way of you and me, as it were, of God's people, and threatens to swallow them up. Right? It explains why the new creation in Revelation is described symbolically as no longer having any sea, no longer any threat to God's people, that which would swallow us up, that which would overwhelm us. The sea is personified in the Bible as a monster. It's called Rahab, Leviathan, a dragon, a serpent. Some of the disciples we know made their living fishing on the sea, and so they would have been, in some sense, they loved the sea. They were fishermen. They loved the sea. But they also knew better than anyone else that you had to respect the sea. In fact, the sea could be quite fearful, quite terrifying, and it could show them how helpless they were before it. So we read in Psalm 107, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of Yahweh, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. So it's important. It's really important to understand what Jesus is doing here. That we see that the sea is to man a chaotic, unpredictable, keyword, uncontrollable. How much of life is uncontrollable? Well, that's everything at a certain level. This uncontrollable force of nature, subject only to God himself. And so the point here in John is that the disciples are confronted now by this power against which they are totally helpless. After the feeding of the 5,000, their visions of grandeur, their visions of glory, this is where they need to be. It's where they need to be. After their willingness to be accomplices, as it were, the disciples were willing to be accomplices with a misguided crowd that wanted to make Jesus king. This is where they need to be. You know, they say, well, no, I don't need this. I needed a good meal for my stomach. Now I need calm waters to get where I want to go. No, Jesus knows what they need. They need to be on the sea right now, feeling helpless. After their failure to truly understand the meaning of the 5 barley cakes and the 2 fish, this is where they need to be. And so we're reminded that Jesus knows what our true needs are. Often we need the same thing the disciples needed. I don't like it maybe, but it's what I need. We need to feel that we've been left alone. We need to feel that we're being confronted with our helplessness. And when they had rowed, it says in verse 19, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. And they were frightened. In Matthew's gospel, Peter is said to walk on the water. We hear a lot about Jesus walking on the water. Don't ever believe it. Jesus never walked on the water. Peter walked on the water. It never ever says in the Bible Jesus walked on the water. Now, I know technically he did, but that's not the point. The Bible never says Jesus walked on the water. It always says every time Jesus walked on the sea. Jesus walked on the sea. To say that Jesus was walking on the sea is to say what? It's to say something theological. It's not to say something cool. It's not just a miracle, it's a sign. That Jesus was walking on the sea is to say that Jesus is Lord of the sea, and all that it represents and symbolizes throughout the Old Testament. To say that Jesus was walking on the sea is to say that Jesus is not helpless before the sea like we are, but sovereign over the sea. We ask then, once we hear this, we ask, who is, though, the only sovereign Lord over the sea? Who is the only one? Well, it was God himself who asked Job from out of the whirlwind. Listen to his question. Who shut, in Job 38, verses 8 to 11, it says, who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Who did that? The psalmist celebrates God's almighty power and rule over the nations like this. By awesome deeds, in Psalm 65, 5-7, by awesome deeds you answer us with righteousness. O God of our salvation, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, the one who by his strength established the mountains, being girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, the tumult of the peoples. In Psalm 89, you rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Now it's in that light that as the disciples are struggling vainly against the sea, we see Jesus coming near the boat, not walking on the water. Forget that. Never say that again. Walking on the sea. That's what he's doing now. He comes to them walking on the sea. Whether the disciples could see that this looked like Jesus or not, and I think they could, John tells us they were frightened. I would expect they should be. Mark tells us that they thought they were seeing a phantom, an apparition, a ghost. Why would they think that? Well, because men don't walk on the sea. The disciples had not truly understood the sign of the 5 barley cakes and the 2 fish. They hadn't understood that yet. Here's the question for us, and the question is, was the one who fed the 5,000 not also sovereign over the sea? We can be more comfortable with the one who feeds me a meal, but the one who's sovereign over the sea is a bit more out of my control, as it were. Was the one who spread the table in the wilderness? Was he only a miracle worker who could satisfy the needs of men, who could fill men's stomachs? Was he not also the sovereign Lord of all creation, before whom all men are called to bow down in humble surrender and submission? So it's only when we see Jesus in the absoluteness of his lordship, independent of my needs. So often we define Jesus and even define his lordship in terms of my needs. But here what Jesus is teaching his disciples is, no, you need to see my lordship, in a sense, at least initially, independent of your needs as you see them to be. It's only then that we can truly rejoice in his provision and in his salvation and the deliverance he brings to us. If the disciples were not quite as misguided or carnally minded as the crowd, indeed they were not, they still had not understood the meaning of the 5 barley cakes and the 2 fish. That's why they need to be alone and helpless in the dark on the sea. It's why they need to see Jesus coming to them, walking on the sea. And it's even why the disciples need to be afraid. all so that we can read now in verse 20. It's the whole point. And hear with them these words. Now we hear with them these words. But he said to them, it is I. Do not be afraid. In chapter 9, the man who was born blind, chapter 9 of John, the man who was born blind, he had been healed by Jesus. Remember, there were those who doubted that he was really the man who was born blind? He responds with the same word Jesus uses here. It is I. Ego eimi. It is I. In 2 Samuel, Abner can look behind him and he sees Asahel following, running after him. And he says, is that you, Asahel? And Asahel can answer, it is I. Ego eimi. But when Jesus comes to his disciples walking on the sea, and he says, it is I. Now we hear more than just a man talking, don't we? In Exodus 3:14, God said to Moses, it is I. I am who I am. Isaiah 41, who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? I, Yahweh, the first and with the last, it is I. I'm he. Ego eimi. You are my witnesses in Isaiah 43, declares Yahweh, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that, it is I. I'm getting a little bit too into it. It is I am he. Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me. So when Jesus walks on the sea, and he says to his frightened disciples, it is I, do not be afraid, he's obviously not saying, it's just me, don't worry about it, it's just me. He's not saying, oh, it's really me, don't be afraid, it's not a ghost, it's really me. Their fear in the presence of Jesus, who even walks on the sea, is completely justified. And if Jesus had said only, it is I, why shouldn't they still fear and tremble? But that's not all he said. Even as Jesus reveals himself to his disciples, and he's not just like revealing himself like, here I am. He's revealing himself to his disciples in the absoluteness of his lordship, which in itself is terrifying in itself. It is this same self-revelation that initially produces such fear, in the end, powerfully drives away all our fears. That's a bit turned around in our heads. That's the way it works. John writes in Revelation of his response to the vision of Jesus in his glory. We remember that in Revelation 1. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid, it is I. We have to get the it is I part to get the do not be afraid part. The first and the last, the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. When Jesus came to the disciples walking on the sea, they were frightened, but Jesus said to them, it is I. Do not be afraid. It is I. Okay? You got that now? And now in light of it is I, in light of who I am and the absoluteness of my lordship, says Jesus, which you cannot control, you cannot manipulate, you cannot use it to your advantage to fill your stomachs whenever you want. In light of that lordship, now, do not be afraid. It is I. I am here, he says to you and me. I am with you. Do not be afraid. In the Old Testament, there's only one who speaks with words like that. So I want to ask you, can you imagine any other than Yahweh daring to speak like Jesus just spoke? Even the highest archangel, for real. So listen to what God says. Yahweh appeared to Isaac and he said, I am the God of Abraham your father. Do not be afraid, for it is I. It is I who am with you, and I will bless and multiply your offspring. In Genesis 46, Yahweh said to Jacob, it is I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid. I myself will go down with you to Egypt. And Isaiah 41 says, do not be afraid, for it is I who am with you. Be not dismayed, for it is I who am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And then one more, as Jeremiah 46, 27 to 28 says, do not be afraid. And you can guess what else he's going to say in a moment. Do not be afraid, O Jacob, my servant, nor be dismayed, O Israel. For behold, I will save you from far away, and your offspring from the land of their captivity. Jacob shall return and have quiet and ease, and none shall make him afraid. Do not be afraid, O Jacob, my servant, declares Yahweh, for it is I who am with you. It's in the light of all that Old Testament context and of the Old Testament revelation that only God is sovereign over the sea, that Jesus comes now to his disciples walking on the sea and saying to them, it is I. And we know what comes after that. Do not be afraid. On the one hand, and this is what's disconcerting to us in our fleshly selfishness, in our fleshly irrationality. On the one hand, Jesus will never be what men want to make of him and use him for. It's easy for us to look around at the culture and at others and say, yeah, hope they get that. But no, this is not about them right now. I'm not interested in anyone outside this room but me and you and me. On the one hand, Jesus will never ever be what you and I, in our fleshly self-centeredness, want to make of him and use him for. He will never ever be that. And yet, even as Jesus reveals himself to us in the absoluteness of his lordship, here's the beautiful paradoxical truth. It is this very self-revelation that might initially produce in us fear and trembling, unlike food at the feeding of the 5,000. This revelation that initially produces such fear and trembling, it is that revelation that actually so powerfully drives away all our fears in the end. It leaves us with peace. So we read in verse 21. This is a grand finale which we can easily miss, but we're not going to miss it this afternoon. Then they were willing to receive him into the boat. Now, yeah, it's just there, and you read it, and you're kind of like, okay, end of the story, I guess. But no, there's something there, isn't there? Just the previous day, the people were planning to take Jesus by force and make him king. Remember that picture? And the disciples were being swept away by their zeal. Now we see a very different picture. Look at this. Now the disciples, recognizing their helplessness, seeing more clearly the absoluteness of his lordship, now the disciples, instead of taking Jesus by force and making him king, that picture, now they are simply willing to receive him into the boat. Now the New Living Translation, which I like it in many respects, it's a paraphrase, but whatever. The New Living Translation, by translating wrongly here, helps us to see the true meaning. Because the New Living Translation says, then they were eager to let him in the boat. That's the wrong picture. That's not what we're supposed to see here. It's not a good translation. If they were eager now to let him in the boat, that reminds us again of the zeal of the crowds and their desire that Jesus should do their will. Yes, Jesus, we're eager to bring you in here. You can make everything better for us. That's what we want. No, what John intends for us to see by his wording here is the exact opposite. John doesn't say only the disciples received him into the boat. He says, then they were willing to receive him into the boat. He's emphasizing not so much the physical event of Jesus getting in the boat. He's not like, oh, well, then Jesus got in, because they were excited for him to get in. No, it's not watching what happened. It's watching what happened in the disciples' hearts. It's their changed psychological heart condition. So the language of receiving Jesus, and he uses that word. This is a big word in John's gospel, and he means for us to remember that. It's familiar from John chapter 1. It says, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him in humility, in trust, he who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Then just a few verses later, from his fullness we have all received, according to what he knew we needed, not according to what I thought I needed. Grace upon grace. John chapter 3, truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we have seen, but you do not receive our testimony. And in John chapter 3 later, the Son bears witness to what he has heard and seen and heard, yet no one receives his testimony. Whoever receives his testimony sets his seal to this, that God is true. And then in chapter 5, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. Okay, got all that? Now it's in the light of all this receiving, or refusal to receive. John wants us to see now the disciples' willingness to receive Jesus into the boat. No, they cannot make Jesus what they want him to be, but they can receive him as he is. And as he proclaims himself to them in their total helplessness and weakness, okay? He's not there for me to make him what I want him to be, but I can receive him as he is in the absoluteness of his lordship as he reveals himself to me as the one who walks on the sea. And when we do that, then indeed he says to us, it is I. And from that, it is I, flow the words, do not be afraid. In verse 14, when the people were ready to come and take Jesus by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew, it says. Again, this is so beautifully put together. Oh, I mean, it says he withdrew. He withdrew even from the disciples. Now watch what happens. When the disciples are helpless, buffeted by the wind and the waves, and the disciples see Jesus coming near. He withdrew. Now they see him coming near, walking on the sea. Jesus set the stage, and they are frightened. Jesus said to them, it is I. Do not be afraid. And then they were willing to receive him, the it is I, into the boat. And then immediately, in verse 21, the boat was at the land to which they were going. We read earlier in Psalm 107 about those who go down to the sea in ships and they were at their wits' end, they stagger. Well, it concludes it like this. I will read more than the conclusion. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of Yahweh, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded, he raised the stormy wind, just like he did on the Sea of Galilee on that day, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven, they went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. Jesus knew the disciples needed to be at their wits' end. Then they cried to Yahweh in their trouble, and the disciples, I don't know, maybe they were. And he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet. And here's the key words. We just said that, and they were at the, what did it say? Immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. And now we read in Psalm 107, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to Yahweh for his steadfast love, for his wondrous deeds to the children of man. So in conclusion, I just want to say to you, it is a wonderful thing to know that Jesus says to us, he actually says this to us, do not be afraid. It's a wonderful thing to understand that he has come to us in the absoluteness of his lordship as the one who walks on the sea, the one to whom all authority in heaven and earth has been given, and he is the one who says to you and to me, even today, "It is I. Do not be afraid." We cannot make Jesus what we want him to be, but we can receive him as he reveals himself to us. And when we do that, by faith, we'll find without fail, and I'm preaching to myself, preaching to you, preaching to me, we will find without fail that he has already brought us, and that he will finally bring us, in the end, safely to our desired haven. Isaiah 46, 3-4 says, and again, not just in the end, but even now. Listen to me, it says in Isaiah 46, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been born by me from before your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age, it is I. And to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made and I will bear, I will carry and will save, which is all the same as to say, do not be afraid.